Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Justifying the Value of Long-Term Innovation in 2025, Betting on Breakthroughs. My name is Anthony Schiavo, Senior Director and Principal Analyst here at Lux, and I will be moderating and presenting during today's session. Joining me for this discussion is my colleague, Naveen Krishnamurthy, Senior Vice President of Executive Partners here at Lux. Throughout this webinar, you can type any questions that you have into the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. And with that, let's jump into the presentation. And I'd like to start with a bit of a thought experiment. First, we have two groups of innovators here. They each have 5 innovation projects. And group 1, they know the distribution of the potential outcomes. 3 of them are low, 1 is medium, and 1 is high return. But they don't know which innovation projects are which. They have to pick in the dark, and they get 2 chances to do so. The second group of innovators, they have the same projects, the same distribution, but they have some information. They know which is the medium return project. So the question is, which group had better returns? And we're going to be coming back to this throughout the course of the presentation. So put your answers in the chat, put your answers in the questions. I'm curious to see what you guys say. Okay, so first, today, my colleague Naveen and I is here. We're going to be talking about just the sort of the landscape of the pressures the innovation ecosystem is facing, because I think we're in a time of some new and unexpected pressures. Then we're going to get into this question of how to measure innovation. We think it's really crucial. If you want to justify innovation, you have to be able to measure it. And then lastly, we'll touch on the narrative that's necessary to support innovation, how you can really take some of this information and drive innovation projects through your organization. So what we have been calling this new era of innovation that we're in is the Jenga innovation ecosystem, because like the game, innovators are having the pieces pulled out from underneath them, whether that's reduced budgets, cuts to headcount, demands for shorter timelines, government funding, venture capital funding drying up. It's a very, very challenging time for innovators. And you see this in the funding, right? For clean tech, VC funding is lower than it's been since 2021, and it seems like a lot of the money has come out of the ecosystem. And there's been layoffs and almost a white-collar recession across a lot of the different sectors that our clients are trying to innovate in. And of course, this has been hit the innovation funds as well. And it is not just for things like NIH. It's also direct cuts to critical programs, things like the EPA. And so this has left a lot of programs and a lot of innovation in limbo. And it's not just politics, right? Even before these changes to the administration, the 2024 CEO Priority Survey had near-term business growth as gaining a huge amount of priority among CEOs. And, sort of these longer-term issues of business transformation, advanced technology, and climate sustainability all losing in the ranks relative to that near-term growth. And I think this quote from Dr. Marcus Kamieth, the CEO of BASF, kind of summarizes this. He says that they're changing their strategic direction because value creation for shareholders has not met their expectations, right? And so there's this focus on really moving towards value creation and pushing everything through that lens. Now, Naveen, you work with our executive clients, our clients who are CTOs, CEOs. Have you seen these challenges reflected in the conversations that you're having?
Indeed, Anthony. Several companies respond to this type of call from the CEO for demonstrating the value of innovation by swinging the proverbial pendulum one way with the centralized research and development function reporting directly to the CEO, the chief financial officer or a financially minded chief strategy officer. They do that, or they'll swing the pendulum the other way, with research and development housed within each of the largest business divisions. Mm-hmm. And then there are companies where the pendulum lies right in the middle. These are companies that have both a centralized research and development leader that is free to make bold bets. And then there are research and development leaders within business divisions that address incremental innovation, i.e. the need for the business, challenges and opportunities for end markets of today. The key thing here is, I think what you're alluding to is no matter which way the pendulum position is for a company, their CTO is more generally thinking and acting in response to this growing demand for returns from innovation in very unique ways. And so taking a look at how they act, behave, and think is quite important. So where do we go from here, Anthony?
So that's a great question. And I think this really sort of highlights the need to justify innovation, but also the need to justify long-term innovation, right? The title of this webinar is Betting on Breakthroughs. So we want to give our clients here the tools, not just to demonstrate that innovation is important, but that long-term breakthrough innovation is a core part of the mission, and it needs to be a core part of the mission going forward. So with that in mind, let's talk about how to measure innovation. This is a question we get asked a lot about. It's something I think, even though the innovation function is increasingly mature in a lot of companies, these metrics are not always as mature. And I think there's two elements to this. The first is demonstrating that innovation spending creates leverage. What I mean by that is that innovation spending is really valuable in a way that compares to other types of investments. And then secondly, that these innovation projects are creating a meaningful return on return on investment. Just that there is a path to actually demonstrate that, hey, this is going to make money, this is going to contribute to the business, and not in some abstract way, but in a very clear and financial way. So let's start first with this concept of leverage. And I think what's interesting is this really cuts to the core history and the original function of open innovation, right? The basic problem is that there's a lot of people doing a lot of research, and they're creating value that their own company or their own organization can't capture. And this has been well recognized, right? I mean, from 1959, Richard Nelson wrote a paper describing that the role of innovation is to allow companies to capture this value created by other organizations, whether that's the government, whether that's academia, whether that's other companies. And I think, the way to think about this and our proposed metric is really that just looking at leverage as what is the total funding that we are accessing through our innovation program, including government funding, other funding sources like VC, academic funding, and what is that compared to our innovation program funding internally. And you can see that some organizations do a really good job of creating this leverage. And one that I call out in particular is a group like Activate. They work with early stage founders, and they give them, maybe $100,000, $200,000 in a fellowship. And that creates a huge amount of follow-on funding. So with that funding, they've leveraged to about a 44x. So for every dollar they spend, they're creating $44 down the road in terms of follow-on funding. Very similar, the Carbon to Value initiative. It's a part of the Urban Future Lab. They are, have this $530 million in follow-on funding against what I think is about a $20 million funding. So you're looking at about 55x leverage there. Now, these are groups who are working with very early stage startups, and there's a lot more that they do beyond funding. We actually had Kevin C., the head of ecosystem at Activate, on just last month to talk about their program. So there's a lot in detail that we can get into there. But the point I would make is that this gives us, I think, a number to start shooting for. And companies are achieving some pretty good results. You can look at Chevron Tech Ventures. They are sort of the investment arm of Chevron, and specifically focused on early stage companies. They have about a $400 million in their first two funds. They spent that between 2018 and 2023. And just in the funding that they participated in, that they participated, I guess I should say, in $3.6 billion or $3.16 billion of funding with that $400 million. That's about 8% or 8x leverage. So $400 million accessing $3.16 billion of funding. And that's just in those funding rounds that they participated in. That doesn't count follow-on funding. That doesn't count the academic funding that went into those startups. And these are for later stage organizations, right? These are not founder level or seed level, opportunities. These are really like Series A, Series B opportunities. So even in this type of more direct investment mode, you're creating a lot of leverage. And, I think there's a lot more leverage here that we're not even counting. Okay. So we've talked about leverage. We know that every dollar we spend on early stage innovation funding, we're accessing a lot more dollars outside of our organization. $8 other dollars, maybe $40 other dollars. But if none of that comes back to the business, if that ultimately doesn't result in cash flows, then it's not actually that impactful, right? So we also need to demonstrate that innovation projects create return on investment. So let's go back to this case study. I gave you all this in the beginning. You've had your chance to put in the answer. Which group had better returns? The group with more information or the group with no information? Well, you might be surprised, but the answer is the group with less information. And the reason is ultimately pretty simple. When this group, guessed or picked an innovation project, they learned something about which type of project it was. They learned if it was the high value project or the low value project. When the group with the information, they were overwhelmingly likely to pick that known project, that medium return project. And they ultimately didn't learn anything from that. And thus, they were a lot less likely to pick the high value project. So you have this situation where the search for high value, high return options is really crucial. And the knowledge of these sort of low risk, medium return projects, it actually negatively impacts that search for those breakthroughs. And what's interesting is this is not just a thought experiment, this is a real experiment. This is from an NBER paper that was published late last year. They did this, they ran this experiment with real innovation leaders, and then they even went further and they applied this to the question of genetics research, where they looked at the whole human genome, where drugs have been developed. And it's really only about 10% of the human genome that's actually been targeted. So there's this very well-known portion, and then outside of that very well-known portion, there's a lot less research. And as it turns out, this focus on a single portion, on a relatively known portion, they find that it ultimately delays the commercialization of a lot of promising discoveries by as much as 1.6 years. So the point I would make with this is that we're really, with innovation, in the hunt for breakthroughs, right? And we need to think about those breakthroughs as being the core part of our innovation portfolio. And the knowledge of these low risk, modest return options limits that hunt for breakthroughs. That's why having an innovation team at a corporation who's really dedicated to long-term disruptive innovation is so crucial, because that will have a meaningful impact on returns. But again, we have to be able to put some numbers around this. We have to be able to say, we have to be able to say comprehensively, like, what are we actually doing? So let's assume that we want to get to a total return or a total potential cash flow of $1 billion. Our CEO has tasked us with this, right? And if you imagine we have 25 innovation projects in a year, maybe a success rate of 20%, each one is targeting maybe a $1 billion total addressable market. We think we can get 20% of that market. That gives us that $1 billion. We can say, look, we have this, we have this potential cash flow here from our innovation portfolio of $1 billion. But of course, I think all the innovation professionals in the audience will know these numbers are not super realistic. 20% success rate would be pretty incredible. Realistically, though, it's probably more like 1%. If you're really talking about being very successful, and it might not even be that. And since that is successful, we have to find other ways to achieve our billion-dollar target. We can't really increase the number of projects. There's just not that many good projects, and we don't typically have the bandwidth. A lot of our clients are working in small teams. So we have to take bigger swings. We have to target bigger markets, and we have to target technologies that we think are more disruptive, that can potentially take larger chunks of that market that really outperform. And so with this 1% success rate, we can still achieve our CEO's goal of $1 billion if we have enough of these really high value, high potential swings that target big markets with really strong and disruptive technologies. Now, it's tricky to actually see if this holds up in the real world, because there are not a lot of companies who publish the details of their innovation portfolios. But interestingly, Chevron, again, has a studio program. And this is a partnership between Chevron Tech Ventures, who we talked about earlier, and NREL. They basically select IP from different universities that are partnered with NREL, and they are essentially running a program to attract founders and innovators to commercialize this IP. And what is nice about this for our purposes is that we can look at one of their cohorts. Cohort 5 is, I believe, closed, and cohort 6 is about to open. We can look at one of their cohorts and we can evaluate that IP. We have a full innovation portfolio, if you will. And so we can ask, hey, does this math work? Does it make sense in terms of generating this ROI? And the answer is yes. When we look at the Chevron studio, again, this is just for their 5th cohort. They have 18 pieces of IP there. I'd say about 11 or so are truly expansive, fitting into this idea of really new markets. It's a lot of hydrogen, carbon capture, and then 7 are more incremental, important things like pipeline inspection or maintenance, logistics, right? And we can look at the potential addressable market size. I did a rough estimate. I'd say about an average of $12 or so billion TAM, really split between projects, that are more like in the $1 to $5 billion range, and then projects that are in sort of this $20 billion and above range, where the potential market is really enormous. And you can do the math, and you can see like this innovation portfolio, it really does have the potential to produce $1.1 billion in cash flows. This is a portfolio that has this potential to return. And now, with 18 projects, a 1% success rate, it's entirely possible that none of these projects from this cohort will be successful. But they're running this cohorts frequently. Like I mentioned, this is their 5th cohort. And so they are trying to push through as many of these projects as they can. And they're doing it in a very smart way. I could talk for hours about how they're structuring this. But the point I would make is that when you are thinking about innovation ROI, these big bets are crucial. This long-term, this disruptive innovation is necessary because you have limited bandwidth, you have a limited number of good projects, and you need some of them to really have the market potential that's substantial in order to generate those potential cash flows. So Naveen, we've done it, right? We've got our CEO, we're pitching innovation to them. We have our metrics around leverage. We have our metrics around ROI. I think we've shown that this is going to be really impactful. We've done everything we need, right?
Well, it's interesting. You set up a very nice and compelling argument for why transformational innovation, Anthony. But let's consider this. The modern day CTO, Chief Technology Officer, or Chief Innovation Officer, is not just working on creating transformational innovation that drives transformative development of the company. They're working on several other priorities that don't go away. For example, one of the first things that they're doing is thinking about how to keep up with the pace of change. And they do this by staying ahead of change, by stitching together market, regulatory, and technology insights into a winning innovation strategy. That's first. Second, they're bringing more and more creativity, speed, and productivity into their daily, quarterly, and even annual innovation workflows. Third, working with people, bringing P&L leaders, profit and loss leaders, heads of business divisions, chief operating officers, and others along on the innovation journey so that both short-term and long-term goals are met. And of course, you pointed out the fourth priority, which is about partnering with the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, in rational portfolio allocation, which is what we are talking about in this webinar. And of course, the fifth one, really going forward, making innovation everyone's business within the company. Now, having said this, the CTO has a boss. The Chief Technology Officer or Chief Innovation Officer's boss, the CEO, has a vote on these priorities and may have some questions or reservations about what you have been discussing so far in this webinar. So let me outline a few of those objections, Anthony, if I may. For example, the presumption you make, Anthony, in the first of two scenarios that you nicely set up appears to be that companies may choose not to know the probabilities of success, high, medium, or low, or the magnitude of potential success, small, medium, or large, for any given research project or the full slate of research projects. In fact, however, the decision to undertake any corporate research project occurs as a result of a diligent process set up by the Chief Technology Officer. It requires estimating these two very criteria, the magnitude of potential success and the probability of that success occurring, at least to some knowable extent, prior to saying yes or no on the pursuit of that research project, which means really scenario two, where there's a sense for the potential for success and the magnitude of success of this slate of innovation projects is more likely what a CTO or a company has to deal with. And when presented with an almost surefire, a sure bet incremental win in the near term versus nebulous wins in the far term, companies will have to potentially favor the former. Simply put, management of today is incentivized by the boards of today to deliver returns to the investors of today before management tenures and investor patience expires. Clearly, therefore, in this construct, there's little room for transformational innovation to thrive in these circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the point of innovation is not just to produce returns, 5, 10 years down the road, right? It also prevents certain risks today, and I think that can really have an impact on near-term, investor relations or stock prices. You can look at Meta as a good example of this. Meta has been investing very heavily in open source AI, and they've been investing billions, tens of billions in this. And when the DeepSeek news hit, their stock price ultimately is up substantially, right? Because it seems like they are really aligned to this long-term area of innovation that's a winner. And you compare that to groups like NVIDIA, you compare that to some of the other AI companies, and they've really been hammered, right? So even though I'd say this investment in open source AI hasn't paid off in a dollar value sense, it's already paid off because it's positioned Meta as a leader, and that has really kept the investors happy with that knowledge.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting example you bring up. Now, let me bring up another example. We know a $10 billion company working toward an exit from private equity hands this year that's undergoing this dilemma. And the way this occurred was, they had to make a choice between continuing to fund 100 plus research and development projects that were in flow. Unfortunately, each of those research and development projects were predicted to be commercialized anywhere from 2 to 4 years from today. Long after current management, long after the current board would have exited the company as part of the exit. Or kill every project that needed more than a year to commercialize, thereby making available the capital that is freed up for M&A that could deliver immediate revenue expansion this year. Quite the choice. kill every project that is only supposed to fructify 2 to 4 years from now, as opposed to continuing to fund existing research and development projects in the hope that a few of those would create transformational change. The private equity owners would have highly favored the former choice. The private equity owners would have favored the killing of a lot of projects that would have fructified long after they exited. Now, the CTO that walks into this situation has to decide which of those two situations to progress. In this case, this particular CTO took a middle path. He chose to subsume these 100 or so research projects into 4 research and development platforms. 3 of those platforms each had some combination of incremental and transitional projects in them. And this 4th platform was truly transformational. That was done so that he could achieve quick wins via partnerships. Essentially, that 4th platform was a partnership-driven success platform. Now, several R&D projects that were going on before this platformization that did not logically sit within any of these 4 platforms, those were discontinued. So what happens? This more streamlined portfolio has strong tie-ins to key growth trends and end markets. It's now defensible to current investors, the private equity owners. And then this platformization helps build an attractive narrative for future public equity investors. And so this is an example where, Anthony, to your point, a CTO has been able to put together this narrative build that was necessary at this juncture. Now, let me bring up another reflection. Well, the context for this is that some have estimated that labor-related expenses eat into approximately 14% of an S&P 500 company's revenue, 14%. I compare that to the cost structure of a corporate research and development organization within one of those S&P 500 companies. Turns out that over 2/3 of the costs within corporate research and development is due to labor-related expenses, essentially the talent. So you contrast 14% to 2/3. That's a big difference. And so labor costs within corporate R&D, we know, have been increasing substantially during the last few years, given dramatic wage inflation persistent around the world. So running this cost center means CTOs will want to aspire for BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goals, like generating $1 billion, the way you set this up, in annual revenues from innovation. However, the battle is with the CFOs, chief financial officers, who are conscientious about maintaining a regime, really, of predictable costs, will instead suggest that if the company has consistently spent, say, for example, 2% of its revenues on research and development, and nothing bad has happened so far, why change? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the dialogue more likely to occur, Anthony, between the CEO and the CTO is not, how can you get me an additional $1 billion in revenue through transformational innovation or incremental or transitional innovation or some combination thereof, but rather, what revenue lift can you get me this year for the same R&D investment that we expended last year?
Well, I'd say 2 things to this, Naveen. The first is that there's a question here of what's the role of innovation? Is it just to keep our head above water, or is it to actually make us more competitive against our, the field? Because the very efficient, the very well-known, those low-risk, medium-return projects, those I think are table stakes, right? In a very substantial way. All of our competitors, all of our other folks out in the market, they're going to be working on those too. So, while we have some opportunity to maybe move quicker, to implement in a more effective way, it's really limited. That's just gonna rise us along with the tide. If we want to beat our competition, if we want to create durable advantages, then we need to be thinking about some of these projects that are a bit more expansive, that are a bit more long-term, that are a bit more impactful, disruptive. And the second thing I would say is that often these disruptive projects are not necessarily the most capital intensive, right? There are a lot of ways to fund these and to fund this research at a very relatively light, early sort of capital stage. We don't need to go all the way out to investing billions of dollars into something that's totally unproven. We discussed this in our webinar with Kevin C from Activate. There's a lot of opportunities to fund these very transformative projects at very early stages. So we can be very capital light here, with our spending on this disruptive tech. It can be a small portion of our budget while having a potentially large impact.
Yeah, no, I like what you said. The way I see this is, Anthony, this scenario of management deciding to continue to spend a limited fixed percentage of revenue on research and development, even when the times call for an increase in research and development budget to make way for the kind of transformational innovation we're talking about, is in fact a call to action. The CTO in this instance should begin seeing the external innovation ecosystem as an ally. Why? To defray costs, to accelerate techno-commercial evolution that benefits this company ahead of others, and to mitigate the risk of being all in on just a few rather than several transformational bets. Recently I was talking to the CTO of an agriculture inputs company, and he's currently threading this needle. But to his advantage, with the arrival of a new CEO that is keen to explore partnership-driven growth, that CTO is in a much better position than he was until recently. That's to his advantage. Now, having said that, working with the external ecosystem is not riskless, is it? Here's another objection that comes up from CEOs in this era where companies in mature industries, especially agriculture, chemicals, industrials, oil and gas, transportation, what have you, they're not innovating in a vacuum. In these industries, a company will need to increasingly consider how competitors and customers might behave as this company begins to deliver on its transformational innovation priorities. So if the CTO is so keenly believing that pursuing emerging innovation or company's transformation is a critical step to building competitive advantage, if he really believes that, he or she does, then it's also fair to say the flip side of that is doing so fast and first is the company that does that fast and first is the one that has the greatest chance for success. Why should this company undertake to make all of those mistakes first and provide the learning crucible for their competitors to learn and build on to create their successes, right? After all, corporate boards are incentivizing management to learn from competitors' missteps rather than offering competitors tutorials on how to avoid missteps.
I think I would really flip this on its head. And we mentioned the CEO of BASF. In that same presentation we quoted earlier, he made the point that innovation is core to BASF because it enables them to be the preferred partner for their customers, right? And so while there is these risks, while these failures are potentially offering up some value to the competitors, it is creating a lot of value for the customers, and it is creating those deep links with the customers, right? So that's one element of this. And the second thing I would say is a lot of these transformational innovations, they're not just working with the existing customer base or competing with the existing competitor base. They're really creating new markets and potentially creating new customers or new types of customers. And so it's about diversifying those relationships as well. So not only can you position yourself as a thoughtful partner for your existing customers, you can also create a whole new set of customer relationships with this innovation program.
Yeah, very interesting. So I think what we're saying is, to use your turn of phrase, we should flip this edifice of objection on its head. Instead of worrying about how competitors will react to our company's transformational innovation successes and failures, we should concern ourselves with how to bring even more formal and informal connections to bear on this company's pursuit of our priorities. That way, a company in this position can create innovation leverage, the kind of thing that you've been talking about in this webinar. We do see how these formal and informal ecosystems are being strung together. There are examples. For example, the Hydrogen Council, which began initially with a few anchor companies in adjacent industry segments, non-competitive adjacent industry segments. And further back, the Apple Developer Program is another example. We now have an entire planet of aspiring software developers building extensions for just one company, one brand. And all of this is happening in full view of competitors like Samsung, Nokia, Google, Xiaomi, Huawei, and others. Sure, they have their own developer universities as well, but Apple has been able to make available an app enterprise that is loyal to this one company. And to accomplish this, what we're saying is, especially in mature industries, more and more a CTO or a chief innovation officer will need to use their own personal brand to begin building these innovation ecosystems around them. The kind of things that Meta, Apple, and others have been able to do through this force of personality. Of course, this has pluses and minuses, but that's an idea that is worth exploring. Exploiting one's own personal brand may seem like an art we each need to reclaim after years of COVID-induced isolation. Some of us are still getting over it, but it's gaining some importance in the C-suite. Recently, the CTO of a European metal fabrication company told me when I asked him what he would look for in a future successor after he himself retires in about 4 years, he said he didn't think the next CTO should be a PhD in chemical engineering like himself. He said instead, the next CTO should perhaps be someone who has extensive commercial, i.e. selling experience in most any relevant industry. The idea being that successful CTOs and CIOs are increasingly going to have to be storytellers of innovation, of brands, of their enterprise. And on that note, I think, Anthony, we've covered at least a few of the many objections that I'm sure will come up in the minds of the audience. But I think we're ready to carry forward some key takeaways, correct?
Absolutely. So first, I think, we talked about a lot about metrics today. Metrics are crucial, but they're not sufficient, right? I think building this narrative, aligning with the C-level priorities, it's critical as well. And ultimately, your innovation program won't get anywhere if you can't do that. Secondly, this high-risk long-term innovation, it's still a critical part of the portfolio. I know right now the pressure is on for these lower risk bets, but those big swings are necessary. They're both for returns, but also for company culture, right? And they have these benefits. And lastly, these big swings, this sort of disruptive innovation, it can have real near-term value for executives, whether it's proving to customers that you're the preferred partner, whether it's showing investors that you are seriously thinking about future returns. If you position these innovations correctly, they can have both near-term and long-term impact. And so with that, we want to say thanks, and we will take some questions now. Naveen, we're a little tight on time, so I think we may only have time for one question. But there's one in here I really particularly want to address. We've talked a lot about the innovation portfolio as a concept, but we haven't really touched on how to construct it, right? We've shown some metrics, but what are you thinking in terms of the construction of the innovation portfolio?
It's a fair question. Now, if you ask that question around the world, many will say, look, we construct our innovation portfolio to comprise all three horizons of incremental, transitional, transformational innovation. And each company can define exactly what incremental, transitional, and transformational innovation is. The issue with that kind of thinking is that those budgets and resource allocations do not stand the test of time through business cycles because of the vicissitudes in end market, macroeconomics, C-level changes, and so on and so forth. So instead, why don't we take a step back? Really, when we think about the 6 key dimensions that are needed to be able to put together any innovation framework of any kind, you have to make sure that these 6 key dimensions are always incorporated. So I'll go through them very quickly. Number 1 is purpose. What is the North Star of this company's vision, mission, purpose? That is sacrosanct. It's the constitution, the charter of the company. That is always front and foremost in thinking about any research priority, agenda, innovation, business model going forward. Purpose. The second is value. Value of the prize. What are we shooting for as a company? How do we secure that value? How do we show that value? Is it about financial returns? Is it about societal benefits? Is it about brand value? Combination of each of these. You have to have a sense for the value that we're shooting for. Given the purpose. So purpose and value. The next two are interesting. Capital. which is financial capital, political capital, other types of ways to measure capital, and you could metricize capital as percentage of revenue, how much research and development you invest as percentage of revenue, or annual budget, the kind of things we talked about, but capital available. And then this other thing that goes along with capital is time. It's another resource, but is it about time to achieve a set business goal or revenue, the way you laid out, Anthony? Or is it about progressing research and development projects that have the shortest time to market? So again, capital and time. And then the last two are also interesting. Fit. A lot of companies, unfortunately, go after fit very quickly. We say it should be part of the matrix, part of the 6 dimensions, but think about fit a bit more loosely, a bit more broadly. What sort of fit to your own existing and evolving capabilities does a specific research and development project bring forward? And then this last thing, which I don't think CTOs think too careful about in some quantitative fashion, and that's risk. How do you quantify risk? How do you measure it? How do you track it? So again, these 6 key dimensions: purpose, value, capital and time, fit and risk, have got to be part of any innovation decision-making framework that you're putting together. Anthony?
Yeah, and thank you, Naveen. And we'll actually be talking about those more in an upcoming webinar. So I hope you'll all join us for that. But with that, I think we're at our time. So I just want to say thanks again. Thanks to my colleague Naveen for joining us and giving us some insight into the mind of the executive. This concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We really appreciate the feedback. It really helps us inform and improve future webinars. And with that, we'd like to thank you for joining and to have a great day.